My parents believed I quit the Navy 12 years ago. They believed it because my brother told them so. Last week, they saw me walk into a military courtroom in full uniform. I didn't say a word when I saw them. I didn't call out to them. I simply walked past their row in the courtroom and took my place at the front. And in that moment my mother froze. My father started shaking. But before I tell you what happened inside that courtroom, I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end of my story, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I always like seeing how far these stories travel. That morning began long before the courtroom doors opened. The naval base was quiet in the early hours, the kind of quiet that only exists just before the day officially starts. The sun hadn't fully risen yet when I stepped out of my car in the parking lot outside the legal command building. I had been awake since 4 in the morning. Not because I had to be, but because I knew what kind of day it was going to be. The uniform I was wearing that morning was pressed perfectly. Every ribbon aligned. Every insignia exactly where it belonged. I had worn this uniform hundreds of times over the years, for promotions, briefings, ceremonies, deployments. But that morning felt different. Because inside that building, sitting somewhere in the gallery seats, were 2 people who hadn't spoken to me in 12 years. My parents. They believed I had walked away from the Navy. They believed I had quit. And they believed it because my brother told them that was exactly what I did. The lie was simple. But its consequences lasted more than a decade. 12 years ago, when I was still a young officer just beginning my career, I received orders for a long deployment overseas. Communication was limited back then. Weeks could pass without a reliable phone call, sometimes longer. But that wasn't unusual. Every family with someone serving in the military understands that reality. At least most families do. Before I deployed, I told my parents everything. Where I was going. How long I might be gone. What the mission involved. They were proud of me back then. My father had shaken my hand at the airport the day I left. My mother hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. Make us proud, she said. I will, I promised. And I meant it. But sometime during those months overseas something changed back home. A story began spreading through my family. A story I didn't even know existed. According to my brother, I hadn't deployed at all. According to him, I had quit. He told my parents I walked away from the Navy, that I couldn't handle the pressure, that I left in the middle of my training because the job was too hard. By the time I returned from deployment and tried calling home again, the damage was already done. My parents didn't answer. First I thought it was just bad timing. Then days passed. Then weeks. Eventually I drove to the house I grew up in. I still remember standing on that front porch, knocking on the same door I had walked through 1,000 times as a kid. My mother opened it. For a moment she looked shocked to see me. Then her expression hardened. You shouldn't be here, she said. I thought she was joking. I just got back, I told her. You shouldn't have quit, she replied. I remember standing there confused. Quit what? The Navy, she said. Behind her in the hallway, I saw my brother standing with his arms folded, watching, not saying a word. That was the moment I realized something had gone terribly wrong. I tried explaining. Tried telling them about the deployment. Tried telling them I had never quit anything. But the story my brother told them had already taken root. They believed him. Not me. You embarrassed this family, my father said from the living room. My brother still didn't speak. He just stood there, quiet, watching. Eventually my mother closed the door. And just like that, my family disappeared from my life. They missed my first promotion. They missed my next deployment. They missed every ceremony, every achievement, every milestone that came after. Years passed. Then more years. I built my career. I served my country. I earned every rank on my uniform. But the people who once told me they were proud of me never saw any of it. They never met my daughter. They never saw the life I built. And for 12 years they believed the same lie. That I had walked away from the Navy. Which is why the moment they saw me step into that courtroom last week, in full uniform, was the first time they realized the truth. For 12 years my parents believed the same story. That I had quit the Navy. That I had walked away when things got difficult. That I had embarrassed the family we came from. And no matter how many times I tried to reach them in those first few months, They never answered the phone again. First I kept trying. I left messages. I wrote letters. Even sent a few emails through an address my mother used for years. None of them were answered. Eventually I stopped trying to explain. Because after a while, you start to understand when someone has already made up their mind. The Navy doesn't slow down just because your personal life falls apart. Orders still come. Ships still deploy. Missions still move forward. So I did what every service member learns to do sooner or later. I focused on the job. My second deployment started 8 months after that day on my parents' porch. It was longer than the first. More demanding. And it left very little room for thinking about the life I used to have back home. But sometimes, during the quiet hours on watch, when the ocean was completely still and the ship felt like it was floating in the middle of nothing, my mind would drift back to that front door. To the moment my mother said, "You shouldn't have quit." I replayed that sentence in my head more times than I can count. Not because it made me angry, because it confused me. My entire life, my parents had been the kind of people who believed in service. My father grew up in a military family. My grandfather served in Vietnam. The values I carried into the Navy weren't something I discovered on my own. They came from home. From them. Which made the lie my brother told even harder to understand. But the truth was simple. He had always been the favorite. Not in a cruel way. Just in the quiet way families sometimes drift toward one child without realizing it. He stayed close to home. Went to college nearby. Visited my parents every weekend. While I was thousands of miles away most of the time, distance has a strange way of rewriting reality. If someone is there every day, and someone else only calls when the satellite connection allows it, people start believing the voice they hear the most. By the time my second deployment ended, the damage between me and my parents had settled into something permanent. They didn't call. They didn't write. And when my promotion orders arrived a year later, the ceremony was attended by my commanding officer, my fellow sailors, and a few close friends from the base. But not my family. The captain pinned my new rank onto my collar that morning in a small ceremony inside the operations building. "Lieutenant," he said, shaking my hand. "Congratulations." The room applauded. Cameras flashed. And afterward, a few people asked the same question that always comes up during those moments. "Did your family make it?" I smiled politely. "They couldn't be here." That answer became a habit over the years. Because the promotions didn't stop. Neither did the deployments. Every few years another ceremony came. Another step forward in my career. And every time someone asked about family attendance, the answer stayed the same. They couldn't be here. But the hardest moment didn't come during a promotion. Came 6 years after I knocked on that front door. The day my daughter was born. I was stationed on the West Coast by then. My husband held my hand in the hospital room as the nurses moved quickly around us. Everything happened fast. Then suddenly there she was. Small. Loud. Perfect. The first time I held her, I remember thinking about how strange life can be. Because in that moment the only people in the world I wanted to call were the same two people who hadn't spoken to me in years. My mother always loved babies. My father used to joke about becoming a grandfather someday. And yet they didn't even know their granddaughter existed. I held my daughter in that hospital room and wondered if I should try calling again. Just once. Just to tell them. But I already knew how that would go. They still believed the same lie. That their daughter quit the Navy. That she ran away from responsibility. And somewhere in that version of the story, my brother was still the one standing beside them, telling them what happened. So I didn't make the call. Instead, I looked down at my daughter and made a different promise. One that had nothing to do with the past. "I'll show you the truth someday," I whispered. At the time I had no idea how that moment would finally come. Or that 12 years later, it would happen in a military courtroom, with my parents sitting just a few rows away. The call that changed everything came on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in my office on base reviewing a logistics report when my phone rang. It wasn't unusual for legal command to contact senior officers, especially when disciplinary matters involved personnel connected to operational units. But the moment I saw the name on the caller ID, something felt different. Naval Legal Command. I answered. "This is Commander Hayes." The voice on the other end was professional, calm. "Commander, This is Lieutenant Carter from JAG. I'm calling regarding an upcoming court-martial proceeding scheduled for next week. I leaned back slightly in my chair. Court-martial cases weren't rare in the military, but they usually didn't involve officers at my level, unless there was something unusual about the case. Go ahead, I said. We believe you may have a personal connection to the individual involved. That sentence made me pause. A personal connection? Yes, ma'am. There was a short silence. Then he said a name I hadn't heard spoken in over a decade. My brother's name. For a moment I didn't respond. Not because I didn't understand what he said, but because my mind was trying to catch up with the reality of it. My brother. The same brother who told my parents I had quit the Navy. The same brother who stood in the hallway 12 years earlier while my mother closed the door in my face. He was now the subject of a military court-martial. I sat there in my office, staring at the wall across from my desk. What are the charges? I asked. The lieutenant explained briefly. Misconduct, fraud related to military contracting, and falsifying statements during an investigation. The details weren't something I needed to process right away, because one part of what he said stood out more than anything else. The hearing will be open to family members, he added. Family members. I hadn't heard that phrase connected to my life in a very long time. Are my parents attending? I asked. Yes, ma'am, he replied. They've confirmed they will be present. For a moment, the office felt unusually quiet. The base outside my window was moving through its normal routine. Vehicles crossing the tarmac, sailors walking between buildings, the distant sound of aircraft engines. But inside my office, time felt like it had slowed down. My parents would be there. 12 years after they shut the door on me. 12 years after they decided their daughter had walked away from the Navy. And they would walk into that courtroom believing the same story they had always believed. That I quit. That I abandoned the life I once promised them I would serve. Commander, the lieutenant said. I'm here. There's one more detail we thought you should know. What is it? The hearing will be held on base. Your presence is not required, but given the family connection, we wanted to notify you. I understood what he meant. He wasn't telling me I had to attend. He was giving me the choice. A choice that carried a weight most people wouldn't understand. I could stay away. Continue living my life the way I had for the past decade. Or I could walk into that courtroom. Walk into a room where my parents would be sitting only a few rows away. And for the first time in 12 years, let them see the truth. After the call ended, I sat there for several minutes without moving. I thought about the last time I saw them. My mother's expression. My father's voice. The door closing. And the quiet figure of my brother standing behind them, letting the lie grow without ever correcting it. 12 years. 12 years of distance. 12 years of missed birthdays, missed promotions, missed family milestones. And now, somehow, everything was about to come back together in one place. A courtroom. I stood up from my desk and walked to the small closet in the corner of my office. Inside, hanging neatly on a uniform rack, was my full-dress Navy uniform. I rarely wore it except for formal ceremonies or official events. But the moment I looked at it that afternoon, I already knew what I was going to do. Because if my parents were going to see me again after all these years, they weren't going to see the version of their daughter my brother described. They were going to see the truth. And that truth would be impossible to ignore. A week later, when the courtroom doors opened and I stepped inside wearing that uniform, it would be the first time my parents realized they had believed the wrong story for 12 years. The morning of the hearing started earlier than most mornings on base. I arrived before sunrise. The sky was still dark when I parked outside the legal command building, and the air carried that quiet stillness that military bases often have before the day officially begins. Most people were still arriving. A few vehicles rolled slowly across the parking lot. Sailors walked between buildings carrying coffee cups and folders, preparing for another routine day. For them it was just another Tuesday. For me it was the first day my parents would see me in 12 years. I sat in the car for a moment before getting out. Not because I was nervous, but because I knew the next few hours would change something that had remained frozen in time for more than a decade. Inside the back seat hung my full-dress Navy uniform. Every ribbon, every medal, every insignia earned over 12 years of service. My parents had never seen any of them. They didn't know about the deployments. They didn't know about the promotions. They didn't know about the commands I had held or the missions I had completed. Because in their version of the story, their daughter had walked away from the Navy long ago. I stepped out of the car and opened the back door. The uniform hung neatly on the hanger, the white fabric crisp in the early morning light. I ran my hand lightly across the shoulder boards. Commander. That rank had come 6 years after the day my mother closed the door on me. 6 years of deployments, leadership evaluations, and responsibilities that grew heavier with each passing year. None of it had been easy, but none of it had ever made me consider quitting, which made the lie my brother told feel even stranger now. I took a slow breath before putting the uniform on. The routine was automatic. Every button, every ribbon, every detail placed exactly where it belonged. Military uniforms don't leave much room for mistakes. When I finished, I looked at my reflection in the car window. The woman staring back at me looked very different from the young officer who had stood on my parents' porch 12 years earlier. Back then I was still trying to prove something. Now, I was simply carrying the responsibility that came with the rank on my shoulders. I picked up my cover and walked toward the building. The courtroom was located on the second floor of the Legal Command Office. By the time I reached the entrance, a few people had already begun gathering inside. Attorneys, naval officers, support staff preparing documents for the hearing. Court-martial proceedings always carried a certain formality. Even before they officially begin, the room holds a quiet sense of weight. I signed in at the front desk. The petty officer behind the counter looked up at my uniform, then quickly straightened his posture. "Good morning, ma'am." "Good morning. Are you attending the hearing?" "Yes." He checked the list on the clipboard. "You're clear to enter the gallery." I thanked him and moved toward the hallway leading to the courtroom. The doors were still closed. A few people were already seated on the benches outside, waiting for the hearing to begin. Some were officers connected to the investigation. Some were legal staff. And a few were family members. I noticed them immediately. My parents were sitting together on the far bench near the wall. 12 years had changed them. My father's hair had turned almost completely gray. My mother looked smaller than I remembered. But there was no mistaking who they were. For a moment I stopped walking. They hadn't seen me yet. From where they sat, they were facing the opposite direction, talking quietly with someone I didn't recognize. Probably one of the legal advisors assigned to help them understand the proceedings. I stood there for several seconds watching them from across the hallway. 12 years is a long time. Long enough for anger to fade. Long enough for memories to soften. But it's also long enough for silence to become permanent. I wondered briefly what they would say if they turned around right then. If they saw me standing there in uniform. If they realized the story they believed for all these years had never been true. But that moment wasn't meant to happen in a hallway. It was meant to happen inside the courtroom. A few minutes later the doors opened. A naval officer stepped out and called for everyone to take their seats. People began filing inside. Attorneys first. Then officers involved in the case. Then family members. My parents stood and walked in with the others. Still unaware I was only a few steps behind them. I followed the group inside the courtroom. The room was arranged in the familiar structure used for military hearings. The panel seating at the front. Legal tables positioned below. Rows of benches behind them for observers and family. My parents took seats 3 rows from the front. I continued walking past them without speaking. They didn't look up. Not yet. Instead, I moved toward the front of the room where the officers involved in the case were seated. The quiet conversations around the room faded as the hearing prepared to begin. Papers shuffled. Chairs moved. The court officer called for everyone to stand. And as the room rose to its feet, my parents were about to see something they never expected. Their daughter. Standing in full Navy uniform. Exactly where she had always belonged. When the court officer called the room to stand, every chair moved at once. The sound of benches shifting echoed softly across the courtroom as people rose to their feet. I stood with the other officers near the front. The room settled into that familiar silence that always comes just before a military hearing begins. The presiding officer entered. Everyone remained standing until he took his seat. "Be seated." The room lowered itself back into place. Papers shifted. Pens moved. The quiet rhythm of official proceedings began. From where I sat, I could see the gallery clearly. 3 rows back. Exactly where I had seen them earlier. My parents. My mother sat closest to the aisle. My father beside her. Both of them leaning slightly forward, watching the front of the courtroom with the same tense attention most families carry when someone they love is on trial. They were here for my brother. They still hadn't seen me. Not really. They had passed me in the hallway earlier without noticing. But now, with the hearing beginning, their attention slowly started moving around the room. That's when my mother's eyes drifted toward the officers seated near the front. Toward the row where I was sitting. First she didn't react. Because she wasn't looking for me. In her mind, her daughter had quit the Navy more than a decade ago. There was no reason for her to be sitting in a courtroom full of naval officers. So her eyes moved across the uniforms the same way anyone unfamiliar with the military would. Quick glances. Nothing more. Until they stopped. Right on me. I watched the moment it happened. The exact second recognition tried to catch up with what her eyes were seeing. Her gaze lingered. Her head tilted slightly, as if her mind was trying to solve a puzzle that didn't make sense. I didn't look away. I simply sat there in my seat. Uniform pressed. Rank visible. 12 years of service displayed in the ribbons across my chest. My mother blinked. Then she leaned slightly toward my father. She whispered something. He frowned and followed her line of sight. And when his eyes landed on me, everything changed. First he looked confused. Then his posture shifted. His shoulders stiffened. He leaned forward slightly. Staring. Really staring now. The way someone looks when they realize something impossible might actually be real. Because the woman sitting in front of them, the officer wearing a Navy commander's uniform, looked exactly like the daughter they believed had walked away from the military 12 years ago. My father's hand slowly moved to the edge of the bench. My mother's expression had gone completely still. Neither of them spoke. But the recognition was there now. Slow. Uncomfortable. And impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, the hearing had already begun. The legal officer stood and began reading the formal charges. My brother sat at the defense table. I hadn't looked directly at him yet. Not once since I entered the room. But eventually he turned. Maybe he sensed something happening behind him. Maybe he heard the quiet shift of movement in the gallery. Or maybe he simply looked up out of instinct. Whatever the reason, his eyes found me. And the reaction was immediate. His face drained of color. For a second he looked like someone who had just seen a ghost. Because the lie he told 12 years ago had always depended on one thing. Distance. As long as my parents never saw me in uniform. As long as they never witnessed the life I actually lived. The story he created could survive. But now that distance was gone. Now the truth was sitting directly in front of them. Wearing a commander's uniform. Holding 12 years of service across her chest. My brother stared at me for several seconds. Then slowly turned back toward the table in front of him. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Because the silence in the courtroom had already started changing. Not from the officers. Not from the legal staff. But from the 2 people sitting 3 rows behind him. My parents. My mother still hadn't moved. Her eyes remained fixed on me. My father, however, looked different. He looked like a man trying to understand how 12 years of certainty could suddenly collapse in the span of a few seconds. I didn't smile. I didn't nod. I didn't acknowledge them at all. Because the courtroom wasn't the place for that conversation. This wasn't about confrontation. It wasn't about revenge. It was about something much simpler. The truth. And for the first time in 12 years, my parents were finally seeing it with their own eyes. The courtroom continued moving forward like nothing unusual had happened. The legal officer read the charges in a steady, formal voice. Papers shifted across the tables. Attorneys wrote notes. The presiding officer watched the proceedings with the calm attention that military judges are trained to maintain. But behind all of that quiet structure, something had changed in the room. Because 3 rows back, my parents were no longer watching the hearing. They were watching me. I could feel it without turning my head. 12 years is a long time to spend wondering what someone would do if they ever saw you again. Would they be angry? Would they be embarrassed? Would they refuse to look at you at all? But what I felt behind me that morning wasn't anger. It was confusion. The kind of confusion that comes when something you believed for years suddenly stops making sense. The legal officer continued reading. Charge 1. Falsification of official records. The words echoed softly through the courtroom. My brother sat at the defense table, staring down at the papers in front of him. He hadn't turned around again. Not once. But I knew he was aware of me. Because the lie he told 12 years ago depended on one simple assumption. That I would never be standing in a room like this. Not as an officer. Not in uniform. Not where my parents could see the truth with their own eyes. Meanwhile, the hearing moved forward. Witness statements. Evidence summaries. The quiet, methodical process that every military court follows. But my attention drifted back to the gallery behind me. Eventually, I heard the small movement of fabric against wood. My mother shifting in her seat. Then my father's voice. Very quiet. Barely louder than a whisper. That's her. I didn't turn around. But I heard it clearly. My mother didn't respond right away. Then she whispered something back. No, it wasn't denial. It sounded more like disbelief. Because from where they were sitting, the uniform told a story they couldn't ignore. The ribbons across my chest. The insignia on my shoulders. The way the other officers in the room spoke to me. None of that matched the story my brother told them. None of it matched the version of their daughter, who had supposedly walked away from the Navy. A few minutes later, there was a brief pause in the proceedings. One of the attorneys stood and approached the judge with a document. The courtroom relaxed slightly as people shifted in their seats. That's when I heard my father again. This time a little louder. How long? His voice trailed off. My mother answered softly. 12 years. The number hung in the air behind me. 12 years. 12 years since the day my brother told them their daughter had quit. 12 years since my mother closed the door on me. 12 years since my father said I had embarrassed the family. And now they were sitting in a courtroom watching the same daughter they believed had failed serve as a senior naval officer. The hearing resumed. The prosecution called the first witness. The courtroom returned to its formal rhythm. But the quiet conversation behind me continued. Fragments of words. Questions. Pieces of a realization that had started to grow. My mother's voice again. Those ribbons, my father answered. She couldn't have earned those if she quit. Silence followed that. The kind of silence that comes when two people realize something important all at once. Because the truth was sitting directly in front of them. Not explained. Not argued. Simply visible. A uniform. 12 years of service. Proof that the story they believed was never real. Eventually, the hearing paused again for a short recess. The presiding officer stood. Court will reconvene in 15 minutes. People began rising from their seats. Attorneys gathered their notes. Officers stepped into the hallway. The quiet movement of chairs filled the room. I remained seated for a moment, reviewing a document on the table in front of me. But behind me something else was happening. I heard my parents stand. Then my father's voice again. Stronger this time. We need to talk to her. My mother hesitated. What if? Her voice faded. What if we were wrong? That question sat in the air for a moment. I closed the folder on the table. Because after 12 years of silence, the conversation that had been waiting all that time was about to begin. When the recess was called, the courtroom slowly began to empty. Chairs moved. Papers were gathered. Attorneys stepped into the hallway to review notes with their teams. The quiet order of the hearing gave way to the low murmur of people talking. I stayed seated for a few seconds longer. Not because I needed to, but because I knew what was about to happen next. Behind me I heard footsteps. Slow. Careful. The kind of footsteps people take when they're not sure what they're about to face. I closed the folder on the table in front of me and stood. When I turned around, my parents were only a few steps away. For a moment none of us spoke. 12 years is a long time to compress into a single moment. My mother looked older than the last time I saw her. The lines around her eyes were deeper now. My father's posture had changed too. The confident stance I remembered from childhood had softened with age. But the expressions on their faces were something I had never seen before. Uncertainty. My mother was the first one to speak. Her voice was quiet, almost fragile. Is it really you? I nodded once. Yes. The answer seemed to hit her harder than the sight of the uniform. Her eyes moved across the ribbons on my chest again, as if she still needed to confirm what she was seeing. My father didn't speak immediately. He simply looked at the insignia on my shoulders. Commander. Then he looked back at my face. How long? He finally asked. His voice was steady, but there was something beneath it. Something heavy. 12 years, I said. The same number they had whispered to each other minutes earlier. Neither of them responded right away, because the meaning of that number had just changed. For 12 years they believed their daughter had quit. For 12 years they believed she walked away from the career she promised to pursue. And now they were standing in a military courtroom looking at proof that none of it was true. My mother took a small step closer. You never left? No, her eyes filled with confusion. But your brother said. She stopped herself. The realization had already begun forming in her mind. My father spoke next. You deployed? Yes. How many times? 4. He looked down briefly, absorbing the answer. Because deployments weren't something you could fake. They weren't something someone earned after quitting the service. They required years of commitment. Years of sacrifice. The same years my parents believed I had abandoned everything. My mother looked at my uniform again. Her voice shook slightly when she spoke. All those ribbons. Service awards, I said calmly. They're given for time in command, deployments, and operational missions. She stared at them, as if each ribbon represented a year she never witnessed. My father ran a hand slowly across his face. I told people you quit, he said quietly. It wasn't an accusation. It sounded more like a confession. I didn't respond, because there was nothing to argue about. The truth was already standing between us. Behind my parents, the hallway had grown busier. Officers walked past us. Legal staff moved between offices. But for those few minutes, the three of us stood still in the middle of it all. 12 years of silence pressing into one conversation. Finally, my mother asked the question I had been expecting since the moment she first recognized me. Why didn't you come back? I held her gaze. I did. Her expression tightened. You came back. Yes. My father looked up sharply. When? The first time was right after my first deployment, I said. I knocked on the front door. Their eyes met briefly. Then my mother whispered the words I had heard so clearly that day. You shouldn't have quit. The memory hung in the air between us. My father's shoulders sank slightly. My mother covered her mouth with her hand. For the first time since the conversation began, neither of them seemed confused anymore. They understood exactly what had happened. The version of the story they believed for 12 years was never mine. It belonged to someone else. Someone sitting inside that courtroom only. A few steps away. At that moment, the courtroom doors opened again. The court officer called for everyone to return inside. The hearing will resume. People around us began moving back into the room. My parents didn't move right away. My father looked at me again. Longer this time. Then he said something I hadn't heard from him since the day I left for my first deployment. You stayed. Yes, I answered. He nodded slowly. And for the first time in 12 years, my father understood that his daughter had never walked away from the Navy. When the court officer called everyone back inside, the hallway slowly emptied. People returned to their seats. Attorneys resumed their positions at the tables. The quiet order of the courtroom rebuilt itself in seconds, the way it always does in military proceedings. My parents walked in ahead of me. This time they didn't sit the same way they had before. Earlier, they had leaned forward with the tense focus of parents worried about their son's trial. Now their posture was different. My mother sat slowly, her eyes drifting toward the front of the room again. Toward me. My father remained standing for a second longer before sitting down, as if he needed a moment to gather himself. I returned to my seat near the officers' section. The hearing resumed, but the courtroom felt different now. Not for the legal teams, not for the judge, but for the small group sitting 3 rows behind me. Because the story they believed for 12 years had just begun to unravel. The prosecution called another witness. Documents were presented. Questions moved back and forth between the attorneys. But behind me, I could feel my parents' attention drifting again and again toward the front of the room, toward the uniform, toward the reality they had never seen. At one point, during a pause in testimony, my mother whispered something to my father. I didn't turn around, but I heard enough. She said for deployments. My father answered quietly, "That's not something someone does if they quit." Silence followed. Not angry silence. The kind that comes when people start replaying years of memories in their heads. Because once doubt enters a story, every detail begins to look different. My father spoke again a few minutes later. Softly. "Remember the promotion ceremony we were invited to years ago?" My mother hesitated. "That was for her? I thought it was a mistake." He paused. "Your brother said it was." Another piece of the past shifting. Another moment that suddenly made sense. For years, my parents had been filtering every piece of information about me through the story my brother told them. Every letter, every official notice, every military document that arrived in the mail. If something didn't match the story, they ignored it, or explained it away. But sitting in that courtroom watching their daughter serve as a naval officer, those explanations were starting to collapse. Meanwhile, the hearing continued. Witness testimony moved into more serious details about my brother's case. Financial records. Statements from investigators. The tone of the courtroom shifted slightly as the charges became clearer. My brother sat very still at the defense table. He hadn't turned around again. Not once. But I knew he could feel it. The shift in the room. The quiet realization spreading through the people who had believed him. Because the lie he told 12 years ago wasn't just about me quitting the Navy. It had shaped how my parents saw their own daughter. For more than a decade. Eventually the prosecution called a short recess again. Not as long as the first one. Just enough time for the legal teams to organize the next set of documents. People shifted in their seats. Some officers stepped briefly into the hallway. I remained where I was. Behind me, I heard my father take a slow breath. Then he spoke again. Not to my mother this time. To himself. "We never asked her." My mother didn't answer. But I heard the quiet sound of her hand moving across the wooden bench. "We believed him," she whispered. That sentence carried more weight than anything else spoken that morning. Because it held the truth neither of them had wanted to face before. They didn't investigate. They didn't question. They simply believed the version of events the person closest to them had told. And now they were sitting in a courtroom watching the consequences unfold. For everyone involved. The recess ended quickly. The judge returned. Everyone stood. Then sat again. The proceedings moved forward. But something inside the gallery had already changed. My parents weren't just watching a trial anymore. They were watching 12 years of misunderstanding collapse piece by piece. And by the time the hearing reached its final stage, they would finally understand the full cost of the lie they had believed. By the time the final phase of the hearing began, the atmosphere inside the courtroom had grown heavier. Not louder. Not dramatic. Just heavier. Military courtrooms have a very particular kind of silence when a case starts reaching its turning point. People stop shifting in their seats. Pens stop tapping against legal pads. Conversations fade completely. Everyone listens. Because everyone understands that whatever happens next will define the outcome. At the defense table, my brother sat rigidly in his chair. For most of the morning he had kept his eyes on the documents in front of him, speaking quietly with his attorney whenever necessary. But now his posture had changed. His shoulders were tense. His jaw tight. The confident attitude he carried when the hearing began had disappeared. Across the room, the prosecution stood and began presenting the final summary of evidence. The words were calm, precise, methodical. Financial records, contract documents, false reporting statements. Piece by piece, the case was being laid out in front of the judge. But while the legal process continued, something else was happening behind me. My parents had stopped whispering. They had stopped questioning each other. Instead, they were watching. Watching the same son they had trusted for years. Watching the same person whose version of events shaped how they saw their daughter. And for the first time they were seeing him in a very different light. The prosecutor finished one section of the report and handed a document to the judge. There was a brief pause while the panel reviewed the file. That was when my brother finally turned around again. Slowly, carefully. His eyes moved across the gallery. They landed on my parents first. My mother was looking directly at him. Not with anger. Not even with disappointment. Just with a kind of quiet realization that hadn't existed earlier that morning. Then his gaze shifted forward. Until it stopped on me. We held eye contact for a few seconds. 12 years ago, the last time I saw him clearly, he was standing in the hallway of our parents' house. Arms crossed. Watching silently while my mother told me I shouldn't have quit. He didn't defend me. He didn't correct the story. He simply let it happen. And then he continued living his life while my parents slowly closed the door on mine. Now we were sitting in a military courtroom. He was the one facing charges. And the truth he buried for more than a decade was sitting only a few feet away from him. He looked away first. Turning back toward the defense table. The hearing continued. Witness testimony concluded. Legal arguments were presented. Eventually the judge called another short pause to review the final documents. The courtroom relaxed slightly again. But this time, the quiet conversation behind me sounded different. My father spoke first. He knew. My mother didn't answer right away. Then she said something that carried more weight than anything else spoken that day. He let us believe it. The words were barely louder than a whisper. But they were clear. For 12 years my parents believed their daughter walked away from the Navy. For 12 years they believed she had failed them. And now they were realizing that the person who told them that story had never corrected it. My father spoke again a moment later. We told people she quit. His voice sounded distant. We told the whole family. My mother covered her mouth with her hand. Not crying. Just stunned. Because once that realization settles in, it spreads quickly. Every memory shifts. Every conversation from the past suddenly looks different. Every moment when they defended the story my brother told. Every time they repeated it to friends, relatives, neighbors. Now sitting in that courtroom, looking at their daughter in full Navy uniform. None of it made sense anymore. The judge returned to the bench. The room stood. Then sat again. The final procedural steps of the hearing moved forward. But the most important part of the day had already happened. Not at the legal tables. Not in the official documents. But in the quiet realization spreading through the gallery behind me. Because the truth had finally done something it had been waiting 12 years to do. It had shown itself. Not through an argument. Not through a confrontation. Just through presence. A uniform. Career. A life that had never stopped moving forward. And by the time the hearing came to an end, my parents understood something that could never be undone. Their daughter had never abandoned the Navy. They had simply believed the wrong person. When the hearing finally ended, the courtroom stood in silence one last time. The judge delivered the closing instructions in the same calm, steady voice he had used throughout the entire proceeding. The legal officers gathered their documents. Attorneys exchanged quiet words with their clients. Then the court officer spoke the words everyone had been waiting for. This session is adjourned. The sound of benches shifting filled the room again as people slowly rose from their seats. For most of the people there, the day was simply the end of a legal process. Another case concluded. Another courtroom cleared. But for the three people sitting in the gallery behind me, the real moment hadn't even started yet. I remained seated for a few seconds longer, organizing the papers in front of me. The habit was automatic. Military discipline tends to stay with you even after the official part of an event is over. But behind me, I could hear the quiet movement of my parents standing up. They didn't leave with the rest of the observers. Instead, their footsteps moved slowly toward the front of the courtroom. I closed my folder and stood. When I turned around, they were only a few feet away again. This time, the silence between us felt different from the silence earlier in the hallway. Earlier there had been confusion. Now there was understanding. My mother looked like she had been carrying a weight all morning. Her eyes were red, though she wasn't crying. My father stood beside her with his hands clasped together, something he used to do when he was trying to find the right words. For a moment none of us spoke. Then my father said the first thing. "I should have asked you." His voice was low. Not defensive. Just honest. I didn't answer immediately, because there wasn't really an argument to have anymore. The truth had already spoken for itself inside that courtroom. My mother stepped a little closer. All those years, she said quietly. Her voice trembled slightly. You were still serving. Yes. The single word seemed to settle something inside her, because it confirmed what the uniform had already shown them. My father exhaled slowly. We told everyone you quit, he said. The sentence sounded heavy when he said it out loud. We told our friends. Our family. He paused. We thought you walked away. I met his eyes. I never did. Another silence followed. But this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence people share when they're finally seeing the same reality. My mother looked down briefly at the floor, then back up at my uniform. I didn't even know you had been deployed, she whispered. 4 times. Her expression tightened again. That's why we couldn't reach you, she said slowly. Yes. My father rubbed the back of his neck, something he used to do when he was frustrated with himself. 12 years, he said. He shook his head slightly. 12 years we believed that story. Neither of them said my brother's name. They didn't need to. We all knew exactly where the story came from. Behind us, people continued leaving the courtroom. Officers walked past us into the hallway. Legal staff carried stacks of files toward their offices. But the 3 of us remained standing there. Finally, my mother spoke again. Do you have a family now? The question caught me slightly off guard. Yes. Her eyes widened a little. You do. I have a daughter. For a moment she didn't respond. Then she covered her mouth with her hand. A granddaughter. The word sounded fragile, like something she had just discovered existed. My father looked at me again. How old? 6. The realization settled slowly across both of their faces. 6 years. 6 years of birthdays they had never seen. 6 years of milestones they had never shared. 6 years of a child growing up without knowing her grandparents. My mother looked like she was trying to imagine that little girl, trying to picture the life that had been moving forward without them. I didn't know, she said softly. I know. She nodded slowly, because now she understood something important. They hadn't just lost contact with their daughter. They had missed an entire chapter of her life. My father looked down for a moment. Then he looked back up at me. We can't change what happened. No, but, he hesitated. Maybe we could start again. The sentence hung quietly in the space between us. Not a demand. Not even a request. Just a possibility. I looked at both of them. At the people who raised me. The same people who once told me to make them proud when I left for my first deployment. And the same people who had believed the wrong story for 12 long years. Maybe, I said. And for the first time, since that door closed more than a decade ago, the distance between us no longer felt impossible. The courtroom had nearly emptied by the time the 3 of us stepped into the hallway. The legal teams had already returned to their offices. Officers moved through the corridor carrying folders and tablets, continuing their work as if nothing unusual had happened. For them, the day was just another completed hearing. But for us, something far bigger had just begun. My parents stood across from me near the window at the end of the hallway. Sunlight from outside spilled across the polished floor, reflecting faintly off the medals on my uniform. For a moment, none of us spoke. Not because there was nothing to say, but because 12 years of silence doesn't disappear easily. My mother was the first to break it. You said you have a daughter, she said quietly. Yes. Her voice was careful, almost hesitant. What's her name? Emily. The name seemed to settle gently into the space between us. My mother repeated it softly. Emily. Then she smiled for the first time since she recognized me in the courtroom. She must be beautiful. I felt the smallest hint of warmth rise in my chest. She is. My father had been quiet since we stepped into the hallway. Now he looked at me again, studying my face in the same thoughtful way he used to when I was younger. 6 years old, he said slowly. Yes. He nodded once. That means she was born 6 years after we last saw you. Yes. The realization seemed to land with weight. 6 years after that door closed. 6 years after the moment my parents believed their daughter had abandoned everything they taught her. My father ran a hand across his chin. "We missed a lot," he said. It wasn't dramatic, just honest. My mother nodded slowly. "We missed everything." Her eyes drifted down toward the floor for a moment. Then she looked back up at me. "Does she know about us?" The question caught me slightly off guard. I thought about it before answering. "She knows I have parents." My mother swallowed softly. "But she's never met us." No, another quiet moment passed. In the distance, the hallway door opened and closed as people continued leaving the building. The base outside carried on with its normal routine. But inside that hallway, time felt slower. My father spoke again. "What does she like?" The question was simple, but it carried something deeper. Curiosity. A quiet attempt to understand the life that had continued without them. "She likes drawing," I said. "And she loves the ocean." My father smiled faintly. "Runs in the family." My mother looked thoughtful. "She probably asks questions." "She does." "What do you tell her?" I took a slow breath. "The truth." My mother waited. "I tell her her grandparents live far away." She nodded, though I could see the emotion behind her eyes. Not guilt exactly. Something closer to regret. My father shifted his weight slightly. "I remember the day you left for your first deployment," he said. The memory came back immediately. The airport. The handshake. My mother's hug. "Make us proud," she had said. "I remember," I answered. My father looked down briefly. "We thought you gave up on that promise." "I didn't. I know that now." He looked at the insignia on my shoulders again. "You stayed." "Yes." For a moment the hallway felt completely still. Then my father said something that surprised me. "You kept your word." I didn't respond right away, because that sentence carried the weight of something that had been missing for a very long time. Recognition. Not of rank. Not of achievement. But of the promise I made when I first joined the Navy. My mother looked at me again. "Does Emily know what you do?" "Yes." "What does she say?" I smiled slightly. "She tells people her mom drives ships." My father chuckled softly. "That's not far off." My mother wiped the corner of her eye quickly. Not crying. Just overwhelmed. 12 years, she said quietly again. "Yes." Then she asked the question I had been wondering if she would ask. "Do you think she would want to meet us?" The hallway fell quiet again. Because this time the question wasn't about the past. It was about the future. I thought about my daughter. About the small drawing she taped to the refrigerator. About the way she looked up at me every time I came home from base. Then I looked back at my parents. "We could try," I said. My mother nodded slowly. My father took a long breath. And for the first time in 12 years, the story between us wasn't about a lie anymore. It was about what might come next. We stood there in the hallway for a little while longer after that. Not saying much. Not because the conversation was finished, but because the most important things had already been said. For 12 years the distance between us had been filled with assumptions, silence, and a story that never belonged to me. Now that story was gone. And what remained was something much quieter. The truth. Eventually, the hallway around us began to empty completely. The last legal officers left the building. The doors at the end of the corridor opened and closed as people stepped out into the bright afternoon light. My parents and I slowly walked toward the exit together. Not as a reunion. Not yet. Just 3 people moving through the same space again after more than a decade apart. When we stepped outside, the sunlight was stronger than it had been that morning. The naval base stretched out in front of us. Aircraft engines hummed in the distance. Service members crossed the road between buildings. The world had kept moving all these years. My father stopped near the steps leading down from the legal building. For a moment he just stood there looking out across the base. "You spent all this time here," he said. "Yes." His eyes followed a group of sailors walking across the pavement. "I used to imagine what your life looked like after you quit," he admitted. The word quit sounded different now. Not angry. Just mistaken. But I was wrong. I didn't correct him. I didn't need to. He already knew. My mother stepped beside him. She was watching the base the same way he was. as if trying to picture all the years that had happened here without them. All those deployments, she said quietly. Yes. All those promotions. Yes. She shook her head slightly. And we missed every single one. There wasn't any accusation in her voice. Just sadness. My father turned toward me again. I told people you gave up, he said. I know. His shoulders lowered a little. I wish I had asked you instead. That sentence was probably the most honest thing he could have said. Because sometimes the biggest mistakes in families don't come from anger. They come from believing the wrong voice. My mother looked up at the sky for a moment. Then she looked back at me. Does Emily like the water? She asked again. She loves it. That's good, my father said. Your grandfather used to say the ocean teaches patience. I remembered that. My grandfather used to stand on the dock for hours watching the waves roll in. He said the ocean reminded people how small their problems really were. My mother smiled faintly. I'd like to meet her someday. The sentence was quiet, careful, but it carried hope. I looked at both of them. For 12 years I had imagined what this moment might feel like. Anger, closure, maybe even confrontation. But standing there on the steps outside that courtroom, what I felt instead was something simpler. Peace. Because the truth had finally done what it needed to do. It had shown itself. Not through arguments. Not through explanations. Just through time. Through the uniform I wore. Through the life I continued building while the rest of the story waited to catch up. My father reached out his hand. Not as a formal gesture. Just the way he used to shake my hand when I was younger. I'm proud of you, he said. The words were quiet. But they were the same words my parents used the day I left for my first deployment. For 12 years I wondered if I would ever hear them again. I shook his hand. Thank you. My mother stepped forward next. She hugged me gently. Not tightly like she used to, but carefully, as if she was still afraid the moment might disappear. Then she pulled back and looked at my uniform one more time. You never quit, she said. No, I looked back at the building behind us. The courtroom where the truth had finally surfaced. The place where 12 years of misunderstanding ended without a single argument. Just a uniform. Just a presence. Just the quiet reality of a life that had never stopped moving forward. As my parents walked toward their car, my father turned back one more time. We'll call, he said. I nodded. And as they drove away from the base, I realized something I hadn't fully understood until that moment. The lie my brother told had stolen 12 years. 12 years of family. 12 years of memories. But the truth had finally done what lies never can. It had brought the story back to where it always belonged. Home.